That's right. Welcome to the October the 27th, 22 Regional Transit Partnership meeting. And we do have a presentation today that will be partially given by Zoom and partially in person. But first, I want to take the time to welcome everyone and do our usual introduction. Starting with some folks that are at our table this afternoon that we really appreciate their interest in transit. Both Sally Hudson, Delegate Sally Hudson, and Senator Creevy mentioned to me recently that they would like to understand better what we were doing in the world of transit. And I said, it just happens that we have a great presentation this afternoon, and they both jumped at the chance to join us. So we appreciate Sally and Creevy very much. And with that, let's do our usual introductions like we always do. Trevor, I'm going to pick you in the corner to start.
Sure. My name is Trevor Henry.
Hi, everybody. It's Becca White. I'm from UVA, Partners in Transportation, which is the department that runs University Transit Service. So we run all the transit service routes, but partner with our buddies.
I'm Ted Reed with JAUNT.
Tom Morgan, I'm the JAUNT representative from Albemarle County.
David Pisco Kirtley, Rivanna Board of Supervisors, Albemarle County, representing the Rivanna Magisterial.
Lucas Ames representing John Urban.
Diane McKeel, Albemarle County Supervisor representing Jack Jewett District.
Lloyd Stokes, Charlottesville City Council.
Creed Deeds, Senator Virginia.
Sally Hudson, I serve Charlottesville and Albemarle in the office right around the corner.
You just ran around.
Peter Voorhees, AECOM. I'm acting as project manager on the consultant side.
Lucinda Shannon, I'm a senior regional planner with the Thomas Jefferson Planning District.
Sandy Shackelford, I'm the director of human transportation for the TJP in the Charlottesville, Albemarle.
And Gretchen?
I'm Gretchen Thomas. I am the administrative assistant for TJPC.
And let's run down the road behind you.
Wyatt Birchfeld, Piedmont Environmental Council.
James Street, City of Charlottesville, representative officers.
Mike Barnes, beat out,
Sarah Bennington, route share in TJP.
Well, I think Charlotte candidate.
Right, and we're delighted to have everybody here. And I think Garland will be joining. Oh, you did. Garland. I forgot to look up at this and I apologize. So would you introduce yourself and we'll do a sound check?
Sure. Garland Williams, Director of Charlottesville Area Transit.
Great.
Sounds good.
All right. And Scudder, we'll get to you in just a few minutes, but go ahead for your presentation, but go ahead and introduce yourself.
Good evening. I'm Scudder Wag, Principal Associate with Jarrett Walker and Associates, part of the consultant team helping you all with the transit vision.
And the good news is we can hear you clearly. Can you hear us all right?
I can hear most of you pretty well. Folks in the corners, it's a little muffled, but most of you I can hear very well.
Everybody needs to sort of project and project out rather than down. How about that?
If you're going to ask Garland or I a question, yes.
Okay. And I will let folks know that if anybody needs any, there are agendas on the table over there. And I think Lucinda's provided some of the reports. So if anybody wanted a copy of the report, it's on the far table on that side. And with that, I will entertain a motion to approve our agenda. So B has moved. Is there a second? Becca is seconded. All those in favor of approval of the agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Any nays? All right, we have an agenda. You also have at your seat a copy of the September 22nd, 22 minutes from the meeting. And did anybody have any comments, edits, questions about the minutes that were in your packet? But we had one packet that went out that had one set of minutes and one that had another, and we just wanted Lucinda wanted to make sure that everybody saw the correct minutes. So I want to make sure everybody has a chance to just review it quickly. And if there are no edits or comments or questions, I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes from September 22nd. So V has moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Al has seconded. All those in favor of approving the minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
Any abstentions? Any nays? All right, so we have a set of minutes that have been approved. That's great. Lucinda, do we have anyone who signed up for public comment?
No, we do not.
Okay, all right. So we'll move then to item 3 on the agenda, which is what we're all here for, and we're excited for you all to present the transit vision plan, the final report. So Lucinda, with that, I'll let you do the formal start.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So the Scudder is going to share his screen. Thank you.
Trying to make sure the audio is good. Moving the mics around.
I'm Lucinda Shannon. I'm the Senior Regional Planner at the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission and the Internal Project Manager for the Regional Transit Vision. I'll introduce the project and then turn it over to our consultants, Peter Voorhees from AECOM and Scudder Wag from Jarrett Walker. So thank you. Today, we're going to go over some background of the project, provide an overview of the final report, and some of the recommendations to take steps to attain this vision. The Regional Transit Vision Plan is a 28-month, $350,000 project supported by the DRPT, the City of Charlottesville, Albemarle County, and the TJPDC. We use data and community engagement to establish a single unified long-term vision for transit services in the Charlottesville area. The project used existing data, planning documents, and reports to develop a transit propensity analysis. For example, identifying where people live and where they need to go, looking at where the jobs are, and where health services are, and different types of things like that. And we also engaged the public and stakeholders to hear their vision for transit in the region. We worked with stakeholders like employers, jurisdiction planning staff, and transit providers to develop a network of transit services that would make the community's vision happen. So the project team engaged stakeholders and the public throughout the entire project. We used a website, surveys, flyers, postcards, focus groups, public events, and workshops to hear from a wide variety of community members. The project was originally scoped to have 2 public meetings and 2 surveys. We quickly discovered that the community had a lot more to say. So we added more outreach activities and targeted transit-dependent populations as the community requested. The focus groups and tabling at the transit center and community events really helped us hear from historically underserved communities. We also had excellent engagement with community groups, the stakeholders. We worked with service providers and the jurisdictions. We met with representatives from the Latino community, faith-based organizations, low-income housing, environmental and youth groups, aging and health service providers, and others, sometimes multiple times. And I'm really proud to report that our final survey participants were representative of transit-dependent populations. We had 25% low income, 50% minorities, and 16% did not have a vehicle. So we heard the community and were able to do that. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to Scudder Wag from Jarrett Walker.
Thank you so much, Lucinda. We want to give you an overview this evening of what's in the report. The report's organized into a series of chapters that go through, 1, why the region needs a transit vision, looking at the benefits of transit and also the current limitations of transit in the region. It describes a vision for improved transit and expanded transit in the region, including goals and objectives for improving service, improving the coordinated land use policies across the region, improving communication and coordination, other policies, and investing in facilities, as looking at all aspects of the ways that the region can improve transit and all of the ways transit connects with the community. It includes the assessment of markets and needs for transit in the region, that transit propensity analysis that Lucinda was just mentioning, and then a series of 2 networks that show how the vision could be implemented in terms of networks of services across the region. And then a chapter describing all of this engagement throughout the process, and a final chapter outlining next steps to implement the vision. So that's the basic table of contents of the report. And we're going to give you an overview of most of these chapters as we talk about what the vision lays out. And one of the aspects in the initial chapter of the vision is describing why think about transit, why think about expanding transit. And one of the significant reasons why is that transportation costs are pretty high in this region. The average household in Albemarle and Charlottesville, the urbanized area, spends about 21% of its income on transportation, which is a good bit higher than the 16% average for across the United States. And that's about $12,700 a year. A lot of the reason that is so high is that most people rely on automobiles, and automobiles are expensive to own, maintain, insure, et cetera. If we look at some of the other jurisdictions in the region, Fluvanna, Louisa, Nelson, we see that transportation costs are even higher because so many people rely on cars, and distances are longer to get places. So many of these communities, 25% or more of the people's household income is spent on transportation. And because of that, the average miles traveled is quite high relative to the average across the US, 20,000 miles a year on average for households in Charlottesville and Albemarle, and almost 24 to 25,000 for people in the more rural jurisdictions of the region. That all has a significant effect on greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation is one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And so transit can help with many of these challenges that in the region, in the community, in terms of costs, greenhouse gas emissions, and vehicle miles traveled. That's true across all jurisdictions. What's particularly true in the urbanized areas.
Scudder?
Yes.
So we had a question in the room here.
I'm sorry, I just want to clarify a question, because I know we have a Q&A at the end. Do you want people to ask questions as you go through the presentation? And I should have asked at the very beginning, I apologize. But do you want people to ask questions as we go through, or hold them to the end of your presentation? What's the best form for you?
I think we had planned at the end, right, Lucinda?
Okay, yeah, all right. So we'll have people take notes and ask their questions at the end. Thank you. Just want to make sure.
So what is particularly relevant in the urbanized area of the region is that geometry bats last, meaning that you have a relatively fixed amount of road space. It's extremely expensive to widen roads. It's also extremely destructive in your built up areas, in your historic areas, which you have many of in your community. And so transit moves a lot more people in that limited road space, and plays a key role in making the most of that limited road space, as well as the green benefits that come from more people using transit in urban areas relative to the alternatives. I will say the other extremely valuable alternatives to the large amount of road space that private cars and Uber, Lyft, and rideshare take up is, of course, walking and biking. The basic challenge of urban roadway space is lots of people in big vehicles like transit, or lots of people in small vehicles like bikes or walking. And good bus service can help with a whole range of challenges in your community. It can be critical to helping people meet basic social needs and be a social safety net for those who may be isolated, have limited incomes and can't afford a car, and have no other people to rely on to help them get around. That's a common social service type goal for transit. Transit can be a key to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as I talked about, can be a key to expanding economic opportunity, particularly for people of lower incomes, but even for a whole wide range of people who might be able to no longer have to have a car and therefore have a greater disposable income to spend on local goods and services. Congestion mitigation, as I've mentioned, health. People who use transit tend to walk more and have healthier lives because of that. And personal liberty, providing people the ability to do more of whatever they want to do and be more free in effect. And so good bus service is fundamental to helping a whole range of potential goals that the community may want. And that's part of the process, is identifying those goals and priorities. A key reason that the community may want to invest in transit is that currently the transit systems that you have do not do a great deal to help achieve those goals of improving access to economic opportunity or reaching many people in social isolation or other goals, in large part because when you look, first of all, at the urban area and the fixed route service area, most service today is very low frequency. This map of the existing system is color-coded by the frequency of service, and frequency is enormously important to how long you have to wait for the vehicle to show up, how long you have to wait when you're transferring, and therefore how much time you have to spend traveling. Dark red is every 10 minutes, bright red is every 15 minutes, dark blue is every 30 minutes, and light blue is every 60 minutes. And you can see that in the area around UVA and the grounds, you have a lot of high frequency service by UTS. Beyond that, there's very little frequent service. Everything is mostly every 30 or 60 minutes. And this is the midday, weekday, what you can expect across most hours of the day. The other significant limitation to current service is that it doesn't run very late in the evening, and many of these routes don't run on Sundays and have limited service on Saturdays. So service workers, retail workers, people work at hospitals that may have to work on weekends have a much harder time relying on transit, can't build their lives around transit, and so have to find alternatives. When we look at the regional picture, this map, you see many of these routes are color-coded in the brown color, meaning that they have limited numbers of trips per day. Current regional services across the Buckingham, Nelson, Fluvanna, Greene, Louisa counties, and in the rural areas of Albemarle include three groups of services. There are the circulator services, which do trips within each jurisdiction. It's a demand response type service, meaning you call to get a trip, but you have to book a day in advance. And so your spontaneity is limited. And again, the hours of service for many of these are limited, and days of the weeks are very limited. Link services are the demand response services that will take you outside of your own county, mostly going to Charlottesville so that people can connect to medical services or things that they can't get in their hometown. Again, you have to book a day in advance, which has limited spontaneity for people. Then there are connect services, which are fixed route, are scheduled. You can show up and go on the schedule, but there are often only 1 or 2 trips a day on many of those services, maybe 3 or 4. And therefore, you have a pretty limited opportunity to use those, and they're pretty much oriented towards commuters going into Charlottesville in the morning, leaving in the evening. Those circulator services, for example, that I mentioned, many of them have very limited hours, limited days of the week. Fluvanna County service, for example, is 3 days a week. Louisa and Greene County are 5 days a week, but pretty limited hours, basically 6 to 5, 8 to 5. Livingston 8 to 4, 2 days a week. So relatively limited hours of service for folks who may want to be able to go places in the evening for social reasons or for whatever reasons they may need. And all of these limitations mean that transit isn't particularly useful for a lot of people for a lot of trips. And we can give you some idea of that through some quantification of what we like to call the wall around your life. So this example is, if you start a trip at Fashion Square Mall, where could you be soon? If you have a 45-minute travel budget, which is, a decent amount of time to travel, how far can you get? Well, this gray zone is saying how far you can get. You can get basically almost down to Central Grounds at UVA in 45 minutes. When you count the waiting time, walking and waiting, possible transfer, wait, and walking when you get off the vehicle. In that gray blob, we can tell you there are 27,900 jobs that you can reach. And that gives you some sense of, if you lived in that place, how free are you? How many opportunities can you reach? There's also 19,100 residents. If you ran a business there, that's a quantification of maybe the employees or customers that could reach you. When we compare that, for example, to by car, it's possible to reach nearly all of the jobs in the urbanized area, which is 95,000 jobs. That means someone who lives here can really only reach less than a third of the jobs that you could reach by car, or in effect, only a third as free. So this tells us, unfortunately, that transit is not really giving people great opportunity from this location. And we can do that kind of analysis across the entire urban area to produce this heat map, which shows you where you have greater access to jobs and where you have less access to jobs, and unsurprisingly lower access to jobs in the farther out areas south of 64, off of near Monticello and so on, or the community college, relatively low job access, versus right downtown, high job access, in part because you can walk to lots of jobs. If we average this out, we can tell you that the typical person in the urban area can only reach 17% of the jobs that you could reach by car. Now, it's basically impossible to make that number 100%, but increasing that number significantly, right now, 16,000 jobs you could reach by transit on average. If we can increase that significantly, we can make a significant dent in the overall usefulness of transit, and whether or not transit's going to be useful for a trip that you might want to make it at any point at any time. And so if the region wants to make a big difference in this, we know that the fastest and most effective way to make transit more useful to more people very quickly is a significant expansion in bus service. It has relatively low capital costs compared to other alternatives like rail. It's very fast to implement, and therefore you can achieve much more useful transit to get higher ridership. You can achieve much more useful transit to support sustainable, denser land uses, and achieve some of the climate equity and access goals that we have heard are important. And it can scale quickly enough to cover a lot of the region, reaching a lot more people in a way that produces a lot more usefulness for a lot more people. So these are many of the reasons why the region should think about expanding and investing in transit. And in thinking about the goals and priorities, Peter will talk a little more about those aspects of defining the vision. Peter?
Thank you, Scudder. Again, Peter Voorhees, AECOM. I'm going to provide a reminder to most of you, I think, of some steps that we've taken working as a group to go through this process. And some of you may recall meetings several months ago where we talked through goals for the project, a vision statement for the project, and even you might recall a report where we put together a set of specific objectives that we were thinking would be appropriate to reach at different timeframes for the project. All of that rolled into how the vision study that we're going to describe further today, how that took form. It all started with that purpose statement. Why don't we go ahead to the next slide here? Before I show the revision of that purpose statement, I want to show three themes that emerged from discussions about the goals. There were three goals that emerged as most important to you and other stakeholders and the public. And so important that they emerged as guiding principles to the study. Equity, I think everybody would agree that's critically important. Multimodality and connectivity. Fine if there's a bus that serves your neighborhood and hopefully goes to where you want to go. But if it doesn't connect with other services, your options are really limited. And so it emerged as a really important guiding principle: connectivity, multimodality. And then finally, efforts to address climate change. We heard loud and clear from you and others that this was critically important for the study. Scudder, go ahead. And so as we were looking to revise the vision statement, we rolled those guiding principles right into the vision statement. And I'll just read it to you for your review, and happy to discuss it later. But just as a reminder, the vision statement: develop, design, and provide transit in the region in a manner that reflects a collaborative, inclusive, and equitable process, representing needs in both urban and rural areas. This transit system expands opportunities for all residents, equity, reduces reliance on automobiles, multimodality, and helps protect the environment, climate change mitigation. Okay, go ahead, Scudder. Quick review of the goals. We don't have to get into details here. Enhance the transit system. This was this goal ranked as the third most supported goal. 72% of respondents said this is so important, very important. So provide high quality, high frequency transit. Goal 2, to expand to areas that are not currently served today. This was the second highest ranked goal, very important. The third, to connect. An example here, and this is again that multimodality principle. An example would be in downtown Charlottesville today. Is there a single location where all services come together? Not just transit services, but let's say you want to take transit to get to Dulles Airport. Is there a place where you can take a bus to get to a transportation center where there's a bus that gets you to Dulles? Or Amtrak to New York City or Atlanta? You know, the idea of all these things coming together. Goal 4, to collaborate. You know, internal and external communication with transit agencies and local governments. And increasing, you know, transit supportive land use decisions. We talked about equity as a guiding principle in goal 5, you know, improve equity. Ranked 81%, very important by respondents. And so a driving concern here is for those who have less access to an automobile today, prioritize service to them. Households with lower incomes, limited physical mobility, lack of access to a car. Grow equitably. We heard a lot of comments that there's a desire for the region to be more walkable and really to serve those communities, again, that don't have access to a car. Goal 7, we call it support, but this is really all about economic growth and supporting the right kind of economic opportunities. And then finally, goal 8, sustainability and climate. Minimize the environmental impact of the region's transportation system. Go ahead, Scudder. And so what did we hear? Lucinda, would you like to speak to this one?
Sure. So we heard a lot from the focus groups and all of the other activities that we did, but again, we heard a lot of equity and climate change and multimodal access were kind of the top priorities. And then we also heard from the riders that waiting is a major burden. It takes too long to make transfers. The buses don't come frequent enough for them to make the transfers. And then there were a lot of people, especially in the Latino focus group that worked service jobs and were not able to get to work or get home from work, especially like if they were working in the restaurant, the bus wasn't there for them in the evening. They also were concerned about the pedestrian access. Like if they were taking the bus and they worked in the 29 North area, they specifically mentioned Target and trying to walk from Fashion Square Mall to their employers was very difficult for them crossing the street. They felt like it was dangerous. They could choose to walk in the lighted part of 29 North where the sidewalk is, but then they would feel uncomfortable with the cars moving so quickly. But if they chose to walk like kind of behind the stores and in the parking lots, then they didn't feel safe because it was very dark. And then with the rural areas, there's less service and less service hours. And one of the things that people told me with the older adult focus group was they get the bus into town for their medical appointments in the morning, and then they have to wait there all day to get picked up to go home. And that's really difficult for somebody who's not feeling well. So that was something that they felt very strongly about.
Thank you, Lucinda. And if we go to the next slide here, Scudder, we'll bounce it back to you to describe the vision networks, the actual concepts for transit networks that help to improve some of these conditions and align with those goals and guiding principles that we've described. Why don't you go ahead, Scudder?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, these networks we developed in draft form and presented to the public over the summer and was part of the feedback process. These networks are here to guide the implementation of the vision and to help you see what are the outcomes that we can achieve in terms of improvement for the community with this investment. The unconstrained network is designed as what would it look like to implement this vision as much as we reasonably can. No defined limit when we were sketching these ideas on the level of funding, and the estimated annual cost of operating service is about $70 million a year. Included in the unconstrained network as well are some significant capital projects I'll mention, which are not included in that 70 million a year, but also could receive significant federal funding. The constrained network was designed to show what's possible to move in the direction of implementing the vision within some assumed funding constraints about what kind of the amounts of funding that you could potentially create from a regional authority similarly structured to the CVTA in the Richmond area. And a similarly structured authority could produce funding of about 26 million a year for the Charlottesville region, including Charlottesville, Albemarle, Greene, Louisa, all of the surrounding counties. And that plus the 9.5 million in federal and state funding per year would put a total annual operating budget of about 35.5 million, which is what is assumed in the constrained network. That's significantly more than the current overall budget of about 19.5 million a year between CAT and JAUNT today. So just a reminder, the existing conditions, as I showed you before, the color coded by frequency of service of the relatively low frequency in most of the urban area being dark blue, it's every 30 minutes, light blue every 60 minutes, and then the red colors, high frequency service every 10 or every 15 minutes. And the regional network, mostly limited trips and on demand, but reservation required services. The unconstrained network, I'm going to do this very quickly. There's a lot more detail on the report. On the right is the unconstrained regional network, where you now have all day services going to Lovingston, to Scottsville, to Palmyra, to Louisa, Zions Crossroad, Gordonsville, Ruckersville, Standardsville, Crozet, so that you have a connection all day long, 7 days a week, scheduled, you can rely on it. supplemented by on-demand zones in some of the outlying towns like Monticello, like Zion's Crossroad and Louisa, where you could call or you could use an app to get same day pickup within those zones, connecting to those on those fixed route services going to and from Charlottesville and other communities. And then further supplemented by improvements to the circulator and link services, particularly an expansion of the hours of service for those circulator services that go anywhere in the rural jurisdictions. On the left is the urban network and the unconstrained vision, and you see far more dark red lines, meaning service every 10 minutes, bright red lines, meaning service every 15 minutes, for example, on 5th, on Locust, and 10-minute service out to Pantops through the grounds and up US 29, which is actually proposed to be that Route 7, proposed to be a BRT corridor. You see some of the purple lines, which is every 20 minutes, and then many more dark blue lines every 30 minutes, so that in most of the developed parts and urban parts of the region are served by 30-minute or better services in this unconstrained vision. So vastly better and more useful service.
Why don't I just raise this real quick? Scudder, you talked about BRT. Would you like to define BRT, bus rapid transit, just in case anybody in the room is not super familiar?
Bus rapid transit, if you've been to Richmond and seen the GRTC Pulse on Broad Street, that is relatively higher end bus rapid transit, where you have wider stop spacing, you have dedicated larger stations, and transit signal priority and other things that help the bus be faster, help provide more amenities each stop, because you're going to try to hopefully get a lot of riders and therefore make it easier for people to board quickly, get on and off quickly to help your bus be more rapid. And a whole range of things that you can do in varying levels of intensity across a corridor to provide number one, more frequent, which is every 10 minutes, in this case, faster, meaning higher speed with wider stop spacing and all these other amenities.
And maybe I could just jump in for just a moment, Scudder. Yes, it's bus vehicles, but the way it's presented graphically, the way you experience it as a transit rider is much more similar to a rail transit type service than most local fixed route services you would have. And we're seeing, across the country and around the world that local communities are really responding to bus rapid transit type services by orienting development around stations and transforming what have been for the last 50 years or so, really auto-centric areas into much more walkable, bikeable communities where it's safer to get across the street. Every time you've got a transit service, you've got to stop on both sides of the street, right? And if somebody can't safely get from one stop to the other on both sides of the streets, you don't have a particularly effective transit service. So thanks for indulging me, Scudder, just to jump in for a moment.
Sure. One of the other things I'll mention about the unconstrained network is there are a number of services that are crosstown, meaning you go through downtown and onward. So the number 2 routes down Avon, for example, goes through downtown and onward. Similar to the number 3 route that's running on 5th, goes through downtown and out to Pantops. And that makes for easier, faster trips for a lot of people, and does a much better job of providing through connectivity for a lot of people from different sides of the city, where today they have to transfer downtown. One of the other assumptions in this unconstrained network in particular is a hub for lower frequency services, because routes that are every 30 or every 60 minutes need a place to terminate downtown and do what we call a timed connection, which is what you do today at the Water Street facility. But with this unconstrained network, you have a lot more services coming and doing that, and you need more space. And that is ideally somewhere on Market between McIntyre and High Street, because you're going to have a lot more of that in this network. And that also simplifies the routing of a lot of services, because today a lot of services have to take a very circuitous path through downtown to serve the current Water Street facility. In the constrained network, obviously you have a much smaller budget, so we can't do as much in terms of significant improvements to service. Frequency is expensive. You double the frequency of a route, you've doubled its operating cost in effect. So you don't see as much bright red and bright blue on this map on the left of the urban area, but you do see some significant improvements in frequency. The Route 7 is now every 20 minutes through Fashion Square and upward all day, upward to the Walmart. It's also extended all the way to the airport. In fact, both networks have an extension of that route to the airport. You see the frequent trolley route through downtown to Pantops, providing frequent service on High Street, frequent service on Avon, some other improvements in going to every 30-minute service on some areas in south parts of Charlottesville. The network on the right, the rural network, doesn't show changes in the actual network in the constrained, because we haven't changed the network of services, but we have assumed improved hours of service, which I'll talk about more in just a second here. In our report, you can get into the weeds on this a little bit, but this is a chart showing you what is the frequency of service of a given route in any network on weekdays. In this case, this is the baseline network, the number one route to the community college. It starts at 6 a.m. It's hourly service until 10 p.m. You see a number of routes in this chart. They end at 9 p.m. Some go until 11 p.m. And they're color coded in that same frequency dynamic, that same frequency color scheme. Weekday service in the baseline network, weekday service in that constrained network. You see more frequency in this chart, and you see more routes that run until midnight and run past 9 p.m., providing better service for a lot of people that they can rely on for evenings. And in the unconstrained network, you see a lot more frequency across the day and all routes running much later into the evening and into the night. So that improvement in span of service that people can rely on all the time is there, and improved even more in the unconstrained. Saturday service, again, you see most routes don't go later than 9 p.m. and most routes are hourly, a few half hourly, and then just the trolley is every 15 minutes. In the constrained network, you see more routes are running every 30 minutes and more routes are running later into the evening, past 9 p.m., many until midnight in that constrained network on Saturdays. And unconstrained, it's even better, improved frequency, more routes running later. And Sunday, the current network has very limited service on Sunday, just a few routes, almost all of them running hourly. And in the constrained network, all of the routes on that map that I showed you are running on Saturday or are running on Sunday. Most of them are still only hourly, but they're there. And they're running most of the day. And the unconstrained network, you have some 20-minute and some 30-minute services running on Sunday, and running all day long through Sunday, which is a vast improvement. And we have a lot of similar improvements in that span of service in the rural services and the constrained network. All of those circulator services I described before that provide that within each county circulation on a day ahead reservation, they would run 7 days a week with that expanded investment in the constrained network. And the unconstrained would expand those hours even more. So what kind of things does this achieve? Coming back to that example I showed you before, where can you be soon from Fashion Square Mall today? Again, that from that place, you can only reach 27,900 jobs today in 45 minutes or 19,100 residents. We have examples from many other locations in the report, but from this location, I'll point out the constrained network is, you have that gray area again, which is where you can get to today in the existing network. The orange area is how much more you can reach in the constrained network. Now, from this particular location, it doesn't look like a whole lot more. It's not a big increase. Other parts of the community see bigger increases, but it's increasing it into areas where you have a lot of people and you have a lot of jobs. So you see a 6% increase in jobs reachable and 15% increase in residents reachable from this particular location. Other locations see much bigger increases with their improvement. In the unconstrained network, this green area is showing you all the new places you could reach, all the new areas you could reach. You could get all the way downtown and beyond in 45 minutes. You can get much farther up US 29 in 45 minutes. And that unconstrained network from this particular location, it's 122% increase in jobs reachable and 168% increase in residents reachable relative to today's network, which is that gray area in here. And we can do that same sort of heat map. There's a heat map in the report itself showing you the improvements in access across the urbanized area. And when we summarize that improvement in access, we can tell you the constrained network on average increases jobs reachable for the average person by 33%. And it increases the jobs reachable in the unconstrained network by 140%. Now, these numbers, I think, honestly understate the enormous increase in access to jobs that you would see, because this is measuring each network against itself, against the others at midday on weekday, when the baseline network is all running. If we ran this at 9 p.m. at night, the constrained network and the unconstrained networks would show vast, enormous increases because there's so little service in the evenings in today's existing network. And there's so much more service in these other two networks. So the extension of that span of service means an enormous amount of increase in access to opportunity across the whole week that is not fully captured in this analysis. When we took the draft networks, again, we had a draft version of these networks out in the summer and brought them to you all, the partnership, and to the public. 90% of the survey respondents supported regional funding to achieve the unconstrained network. They were very supportive of both the unconstrained and constrained networks. Interestingly, though, when asked if the constrained network does enough to improve transit, 73% of people said no, suggesting that they wanted the higher investment of the unconstrained network to really achieve what they thought was necessary to improve transit in the region. The vast majority also said that it was important to fund both the constrained and unconstrained networks. 3/4 or more of respondents said that they thought it was very important to fund these improvements. More than 90% of respondents said that they would support that BRT service on 29. That's an important thing, in part because implementing a BRT on 29 would require some significant thinking and changing of layout of where you put stations, changing some of the pedestrian infrastructure. If you were in Richmond or saw the construction of BRT in Richmond on Broad Street, you probably saw there was a lot of disruption. And so BRT is an enormously valuable investment, but it can also be a challenging investment as you construct and build it. And when asked what might be missing, some key items people noted were some desires for some additional rural and interregional services. So we added, for example, service to Gordonsville in the final unconstrained network. A desire for alternative fuel and electrification. And so we did describe in the goals and priorities of the plan, the desire to electrify or otherwise get transit onto carbon-free fuels in the future. Improvements to bike and walk access. And so we describe again in some of the text aspects of the plan, the importance of improvements to walk access, as well as the connectivity of park and ride and pickup drop-off locations, particularly as you look out to those services that go farther out to small towns, to rural areas across the region. So with that, Lucinda, you want to talk about the next steps?
Yeah, thank you, Scudder. So how do we bring this vision to life? The consultants recommended many actions. Some of them were finding more funding, developing a regional body to help with transit planning and communications among the jurisdictions and providers, including transit and land use planning, For example, making streets and intersections safer for pedestrians, supporting transit providers with things like hiring more drivers, developing a system to track service performance so that we know that what we're paying for is working, and building a consensus around a possible bus rapid transit corridor. Next slide. So we're taking comments on this report and the study until November 10th, and then we will add those comments to the report and have a final draft to you by November 30th. And you can send your comments to me. My email is on the screen, or you can stop by or call me. Oh, and next slide. And now we're going to open it up for questions and discussion.
So we do want to open that for questions. I'm sure there's some questions.
Yeah. Heather, can you stop sharing your screen so we can see everybody?
Yeah, I'd like to make sure Garland's still there and there are other folks.
Yeah, Peter Thompson.
Yeah, it's on there. Some other folks. That way, if you all have questions, either shout out or raise your hand so we can see you on the screen. So let me open it up for questions, comments, concerns, discussion. Yeah, sure.
I wonder what's the ridership of BRT and Richmond? They have some problems in the beginning. How long does it take for them to get people used to riding it?
Scudder, do you happen to know?
I only heard part of that question.
It was about ridership on the Pulse BRT in Richmond. Do you happen to know how riders have adopted that and how many are riding these days?
When it was originally launched in 2018, its ridership was well above the original prediction. I think the original prediction was opening year ridership would be 2,000 riders a day on average, and they were already at like 4,000 within the first year. It was very, very successful. There was the main challenges with respect to existing riders adapting to the new service was that the new stops and stations were sometimes more widely spaced, and that in many cases was upsetting. Garland probably knows the exact numbers, right, Garland? You should ask Garland that question, actually. I think I'm in the right ballpark on the numbers there. And so anyway, the wider stop spacing was definitely a challenge for some existing riders. And there was probably one or two stations that should have been placed a little more evenly across the route, and that's a function of the challenge of building the larger stations and finding the space within the infrastructure of an existing right-of-way.
Ken, you had a question?
Maybe I missed it, but I didn't see Nelson County represented on any of the vision stuff, especially circulator. Nelson County is a founding member of JAUNT, so it's kind of an important group. Well, I see that, but on the chart, I didn't see, maybe I just missed it.
They should be in there.
Okay, maybe I just missed it.
We did a books with Nelson County as
Okay,
well.
good.
So I guess the question is, I'm curious now too, is Nelson there, Scudder?
Yes, Nelson County is on the
Okay.
maps, and in the unconstrained network, there's a recommended all-day service to Livingston, and recommendations for improvements in the span of service for their circulator services. So yes, we've definitely looked at Nelson and been thinking about Nelson.
All right. Yeah.
Thank you, guys. Good to see you again. As we have this opportunity to comment, will there be I know we have a paper copy and a PDF copy, but sometimes it's a little hard to follow some of the routes on the piece of paper. Is there like a digital presentation somehow where the routes could be separated out so we can kind of see where they go, number one, and number two, will there be any sort of addendum that has maybe some of the raw data that you were showing today in terms of the comments that came back from the public engagement periods and stuff like that? I guess I'm just asking, so you have this opportunity between now and, November 10th. Just if there's any additional, clarifications we can get, beyond a PDF file or these slides, specifically in those pathways.
So I'll throw that back to the consultancy.
Yeah. Scudder, do you have any insight on that, or could you hear the question? And
Yeah.
I'll start with the one about an interactive map.
Yeah, so I think we could, I'd have to double check with my staff, but I think we could provide a link to the remix map of the two networks. That would allow you to look at individual links.
Thank you.
And then on the raw, the raw data on engagement, we need to talk with Will Cockrell, who.
Well, maybe not raw data, maybe that's too strong,
Yeah.
but maybe some of that summary stuff
Yeah.
that Listener sharing, or, just a little bit more than just the big themes here, because there was some pretty rich information.
Yeah, I was gonna ask for that too, so I think maybe what you're getting at is, I was gonna ask later if we could have this presentation, because it did.
Yeah,
have
because it
some-
complements, it's a
Yes.
little bit different in there than was,
Right,
in here and was in our package.
yeah, so we can make sure, if you don't mind, Scudder, that all of us get this presentation that we just saw today. Because it has the
Absolutely.
data I'm interested in as well. So Becca, does that cover your?
Okay, I just have, affect a question.
Sure.
There's something on the map on page 56 it's in the legend called a busway stop. What is that? It's on page 56. It's the unconstrained network. It has a busway stop.
Yes,
Yes.
so.
Except that I don't see it I see it in the legend. I don't see it in.
So in the unconstrained plan, there's a recommendation that Route 7 on the unconstrained map is a BRT route, a BRT corridor, and there's approximate locations of suggested stops. And so those little white and the white dots.
Now
with the
I
black
see them.
circle,
Thank you.
Yep.
I see them now.
Right next to the Emmett North label near Barracks Road is one of them.
Thank you.
So a busway stop, Scudder, then would be a bus rapid transit station.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, we've had about 3 hands up here. Sally, you had a question.
Scudder, thank you so much for the presentation, and Peter and everyone who worked to put it together. I would love to hear you talk more about how you prioritize the on-demand zones. Maybe there's more written information here, but in particular, Pantop seems like this huge winner from this opportunity. And I would love to hear more about that, and in particular, whether the Jewett side of 29 was also in the mix, and how that priority happened.
So for the Pantops area and the 29 North area zones, we basically brought in the recommendations from the microtransit study that that PDC and Kat and John had worked with previously over the last year, and the recommendations from that study to implement pilot zones in those areas. So those two kind of got incorporated fairly directly from the recommendations of that study. And then as we looked beyond the urbanized area towards the rural areas, we were looking at where our kind of small town zones with enough activity that you would get probably a good deal of kind of same day request for movement within them, and where based on conversations with providers and with PDC, felt like it were sensible recommendations for like Zion's Cross Road and Louisa, for example. You've got enough demand that you probably would have a good amount of same day movement. So that's the basic thinking. I think that went into those, and happy to follow up with if there's more interest in that question.
And I think you were also asking about the Jewett. So when Sally mentions you're talking about the Jack Jewett side.
Yeah, in particular, because I think of both Pantops and Barracks Road
Right.
as being these commercial centers and.
Right. So when she says the Jack Jewett, she's referencing one of the magisterial districts, but what she means is where the city limits start, right? And we have Stonefield, and then, so it's that west side of 29 heading up 29 North.
And maybe if I understood Scudder's answer, I need to go back and do some reading to some of the previous reports about the microtransit studies, because maybe that surfaced from an earlier project.
Yeah, that would be the place to look on that 29 North zone. If the answer is not there, the other thing I think to note is, of course, as a vision plan, there's a lot of details that would get finalized as you implement some of these things. And, these zone boundaries shouldn't be taken as, the final gospel and what should be done for now and forevermore. That these things will adapt a little bit.
I think you really get to that a little bit. That Albemarle feasibility expansion site that you're talking about, that was also specific to Albemarle County. So if we're talking about why isn't that service also recommended to the City of Charlottesville, it's because we're referencing another study that combines with the recommendations to Albemarle because it was explicitly to increase service in Albemarle. I think that the answer read my mind, though, but I was thinking in sort of similar character, Stonefield and Antops, and sort of wondering if they were cousins.
Yeah, and looking at job centers.
Yeah.
For the microtransit, they looked at 3 areas, Tops, 29 North, and Monticello, and they came up with 2, which was Tops and 29 North. And they would actually take one of the cars from 29 North, would serve as Tops if there's a need to go back and forth, so you have 2 cars, and then one that can go back and forth also.
So we had a couple of studies that were happening at the same time, and we were trying to marry the information in this. Yes, and I know Brian has a question too. So Peter, you go next, and then we'll get to Brian.
Thank you, Diane. Sorry, I'm not there to join you all in person today, but I'm actually on vacation
Looks like
this
you're
week.
somewhere fun. Yeah, it looks like you're somewhere fun.
Yeah, I'm in my rocking chair on vacation. Thank you, Peter and Scudder, for the presentation. A lot to like in that. I appreciate particularly the recommendations of making sure we're tying this to land use planning and make sure we don't forget pedestrians and bicyclists and their ability to get to transit, which we know is a major issue in our community. My question is around the 90% and 75% of responders who voted for funding these 2 models. 75% to me, even on the unconstrained, is encouragingly high in an era where Americans can't seem to even get to 50% to agree on much of anything. I'm wondering if you can speak at all on your experience of how that might benchmark with other studies of that level of support for finding the funding for these improvements. Thank you.
Yeah, you certainly shouldn't take these survey results, 75% support, as you would get 75% support in, a referendum. This is, these surveys are obviously self-selected people who were willing to respond to a survey that was on the web, that people went out to the transit center to ask people to respond, and so on. And so it's certainly encouraging that the self-selected responders were very, very positive about this, but that shouldn't be an obvious signal that the average Joe, anybody, is going to say absolutely yes to this, because it is a significant funding ask of the region. So our experience has been in other places like Wake County and Indianapolis, where we did work with communities to do vision plans like this that went to the voters as referendums, is that the partnerships of cities, transit agencies, community stakeholders, many of you who are in the room today, social service advocates, business interests in the community, like major employers, developers who may be on board for reasons of, walkable redevelopment and so on. If you have a strong consensus among all of those entities that this is the worthwhile thing to do, you can move the needle on public, acceptance. And that has been kind of the winning formula that we've seen in a lot of other communities.
Okay, then I think Brian, that's the next question.
Thank you for your presentation. I appreciate it. I have a kind of a culture question here having to do basically with cost and bang per buck and questions like that. So the Help me see if I'm understanding this correctly. So if the unconstrained network, say, is going to increase the revenue hours by 113% for CAT and 154% for JAUNT, that's the constrained network. So roughly for that investment of $35 million, am I thinking about this correctly? We'll get twice as many hours available for people to ride the bus.
Approximately, yes. That's what the basic math is that we followed in estimating operating costs here is you have a certain amount of cost per revenue hour today, per service hour. Revenue hour is one bus running on the street for 1 hour, and your operating costs tend to rise on a pretty consistent basis as your revenue hours do. There's obviously certain fixed overhead costs. But
So
yeah,
if we were
that
just like this ballparking this, if we said essentially for $35 million a year investment, although some of this would be coming to the federal government, I guess, and the state, we would be doubling the amount of availability for people to ride transit.
you would be doubling, yes, the service hours almost.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
And then if we compare that to the constrained, looks like unconstrained. Basically, that will be another tripling in terms of a CAT, in tripling again or quadrupling in terms of JAUNT. And the difference in investment there is another $35 million. The difference in investment, in other words, we're going from 35.5 for the constrained and then 70 for the unconstrained. Is that correct?
That's the total, yes, the total approximate operating cost. Yes.
Okay, is it capital on both or just capital on the unconstrained?
There's no major capital project assumption in that $70 million number. No. So like building a BRT would be over and above that. But of course, building a BRT is a couple of year investment. $70 million a year is the ongoing every year. You've got to fund that cost.
And the baseline is 19 million right now for CAT and JAUNT, correct?
Right.
Right.
Approximately.
And the
Yes.
other thing, Scudder, I think about this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is not necessarily an either or. We have a baseline now. We can do what we have in the constrained.
Mhm.
We can go to the unconstrained, or we can go somewhere in the middle if there's something that we see. So it's not that we spend this amount or that amount. There's a
Precisely.
contingency.
They're sort of guides of if you went this much higher, this is what you could achieve. And if you went, 2 to 3 times higher than that, this is what you could achieve. And certainly, if you decided to pick a number somewhere in between or somewhere between existing and constrained even, you would end up with less than what's in the constrained, but you obviously would make a significant improvement. So
If we invested in the unconstrained, there would be a significant improvement, like a doubling of hours that people, in terms of what we'd be able to offer the community.
Yeah.
Just again, really rough sort of way of thinking about this. If we were to invest in that, and then to Deanna's point, maybe 5 years after that, or I guess, is it possible to set in place where this is our investment to get to the unconstrained? And then, the constrained, and then basically set up sort of an investment plan for the next decade of how we get to the constrained.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You could think of it as your constrained is what you want to get to in the next 5 years, and your unconstrained is when you want to get to in the next, 20 years. That's another way you could imagine this.
Go ahead, sure, absolutely.
The other question then has to do with the governance study, and who's working on that? When will we see that?
That should be finished around the end of December. No,
No, a year.
Oh, you're.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It's gonna kick off.
So it's really important to realize that we're not making the decision on this money and what we're doing right now in the next month or two. We have the ongoing governance study that's going to be playing out over the next year. That will determine the players at the table who wants to participate. We have to figure out yet what counties want to actually participate and how what the governance would actually look like. And please, guys, correct me if I say anything wrong, but deciding that is a year from this December, so that's a ways away yet. So if there is still time to be thinking about this, working with the community, we want many of our General Assembly representatives. It was great to have 2 of them today, but we need to be introducing more of our General Assembly representatives in our locality to this topic.
And I'm correct in thinking that the end game of this, into the governance study, is that perhaps you would set up transportation authority. I
Yeah.
think it exists around Richmond, Hampton Road, Northern Virginia, and the 81 corridor. You'd be able to generate money from the localities to pay for
Right.
this transit.
And that was the purpose. I will remind everybody that's at the table that, and most of us go back a long time, that looking towards an authority was why the Regional Transit Partnership was established to begin with. We established ourselves 4 or 5, how many years ago? 4 or 5 years, I've lost track. Just like my birthday, I've lost track of time. We established ourselves to say, we need to see, we have issues around transit in our community. We want the players at the table. We need to make sure that we all understand how everybody operates, that we can get along, to be perfectly honest with you. Playing in the same sandbox is important. And then looking towards how do we set up an authority which gives us the funding mechanism. You're exactly right. And that governance study is working towards that.
And it seems to me that what Brian's talking about, that having a 5 or 10-year plan and a 20-year plan probably makes sense. If you're talking about to generate this kind of money, and with a BRT system, that's a significant.
Oh, yeah.
capital investment.
Yeah.
You're gonna do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think though you have to establish, there's probably, when you look at the constraint, in my head, I'm thinking, y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, there is a certain amount you have to invest to get started to make it work to begin with. And that may be the constrained level. I don't know.
And I guess one question I have, and maybe this is something that Mr. Williams can talk to city councilors about at some point, but you're making investments now in the fleet. And I'm hoping that whatever those investments are will be a fit with sort of what a constrained network would look like anyway.
We can't hear you. There you go.
Part of what we're trying to get done is when I come to council about my early vision about getting to kind of a 15-minute model. That was a long range model. That's not like an overnight thing. That was, that's a 7 to 10-year window in itself. Because what we have to do is have a plan that we can articulate in front of VDRPT and the feds that will allow us to increase our fleet size. So it's not an overnight automatic thing that's going to happen anyway. But as we continue to build out our model, that's where the whole discussion about what the mix of alternative fuel vehicles will look like. So we're working through that part of the plan also. But there's significant outlays of capital that will have to happen to build out our fleet and to build the infrastructure necessary to support whatever alternative fuel vehicle we purchase. So there are additional funding needs that we'll have to invest in. There's a local match. It's not as significant on the rolling stock, the fleet size, but it is pretty significant, 20, 30, potentially even up to 50% on the capital side, depending on what we're doing. So we do need to take advantage of the fact that there's some money out there, and the studies that we're doing now, like the one that's that, the team has done, AECOM and Jared Walker, will be the fuel that we need to have those conversations with the General Assembly, with VDRPT, with the state to ask for additional funding. So all of this is being done to set up nicely for us to be able to get in line to get additional funding.
And Garland, you all are doing, or I think in the process of doing some work around a fuel, what type of fuel study. I know JAUNT is doing one as well. I don't know, Ted, if you want to just mention that.
Well, we're piggybacking off of the same song, Garland.
I just want people to understand
Right.
that, yeah. So both John and Kat are looking at fuel and what types of fuel would be needed, or whatever, I guess, what the mix might be.
Right.
Because there might be very well, not that we're gonna just mix gasoline and kerosene, but there is a mix of electric and whatever, so, yeah.
We're thinking oil and vinegar.
There you go.
Big salad.
But there probably will be some sort of mix, I would assume that someone or another. That,
Sorry, I have a question on another matter.
yeah, go right ahead unless somebody else had something they wanted. So Brian, did we answer your question? I just want to make sure that.
Yeah, I think I'd be interested in talking some more with Mr. Williams offline about just making sure if we're following this sort of path, how the work that you're doing aligns with it. I realize there's a lot of different, we may or may not fund all of this, and you've got to make decisions now about the system that you have. And so I'd just be interested in a further conversation with you, I think, offline. And then, this is maybe an awkward question, is there anything we can do to make that governance study happen quicker?
Well,
What sets the cadence or this timeframe for this thing is based off staff availability?
We're working with all of our local jurisdictions to develop a consensus. So we're gonna need to meet with them multiple times individually and as a group. And scheduling those meetings with like 25 elected officials and high staff members is a lot. But we need to have enough time to build consensus and get everything.
We went in 5 years.
bless her heart, she's been sending out doodle polls like crazy. And Becky, you had another question.
Yeah, one of the things in the presentation that I did not see here yet, were those comments about what was missing, like when you asked the people that were engaged, what did you not see? And sometimes you get really good information on that. And I wondered if any of that could is this an appropriate comment to say maybe in the next steps, those issues could be highlighted. I know the governance study is by far the biggest next step that must be taken, but just don't want to miss that interesting information about what people raise, because it's very, very interesting. And I would add to what might have been what was missing, what is how regional transit that outside our planning district engages with this vision plan as well. So we have transportation coming in from Richmond, we have transportation going up to Northern Virginia, and we have the Austin Express
Waynesboro
coming in. So that seemed to be missing, if you will, but not that it's a scope creep or here we are at the end and want to add something. It's just that maybe that can be recognized both with the people who engaged and maybe if I had a comment about adding that into the next step, not to solve it, but just to say it's one of the things we can talk about as this thing unfolds.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because we do have other areas that are being touched, right?
Yeah.
It's a great point. Yes, sir.
Just one quick response to that. A lot of support for the unconstrained, but it's going to take a lot of work to get there. But I think that figure of, in the short survey that was really targeting like transit riders, 90% support for, finding a way to do bus rapid transit. And that's certainly not in the constraint.
Right.
Well, and the capital costs for it aren't in the unconstrained either.
Right.
Right.
So probably 50% federal funding, something like that is generally a safe assumption.
but it's to change.
Oh, yeah, and as Garland knows, it has, ripples through, constructs that are not funding construct, you know, they're just neighborhood and businesses and all that.
That was interesting that you said 50%, you're gonna assume 50% federal fund.
That's
That's
pretty typical.
okay, good. That's good to know. All right.
But sometimes the Fed like a larger local share to make the project that much more competitive.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Lloyd,
A few questions. First of all, when we talk about 35 million for the constrained, 71 million for the unconstrained, is that in that amount over and above what we're presently spending? Or is that, I think somebody mentioned $19 million right now.
yeah, that's spelled out in the report.
So just to be
somewhere.
clear, if we were to do the constrained model, we would essentially be doubling our costs. And if we were to do the unconstrained model, we'd be essentially quadrupling our costs. Is that?
So the 35.5 million for the constrained is the estimated total operating cost, not in addition to just the total estimated operating cost. So roughly 19 million, and then you would go up to 35.5, not 35.5 additional. So that's how those numbers shake out.
That's what I thought, but I just wanted to be clear. Second question is, if we were to decide that we wanted to move towards either of these models, and obviously we would have to have the authority and all the rest of that stuff. Generally speaking, do transit authorities making, I mean, I assume that there are other places that have made these kinds of changes over some period of time. Do they sort of slide into the increase, or do they do a jump into the increase, or how does that work?
There's definitely a typical phasing of an expansion. I mean, you wouldn't immediately, within a year or two, go from your current system to the unconstrained network, or even possibly the constrained network. That's a pretty big expansion. So for example, in our work in Wake County, the Wake County Transit Plan had a pretty significant expansion of service and investment in BRT corridors. Voters approved their referendum, their sales tax dollars started coming in the door, and within the first 2 years, there was, I forget the exact percentage, but it was maybe a 10 or 15% increase in bus service. And they have slowly phased in other expansions, and now they're doing corridor studies and completing their federal studies to be able to fund their BRT and get their 50% federal funds for their BRT corridors. So there's definitely a phased implementation, often over a number of years, for a doubling of service, because that is a big jump.
Yeah. I mean, do you tend to figure, hey, let's shoot for a 10 to 15, if you have let's say a 100% bite that you're going to make, figure like 15% the first year, 15% the second, and sort of phase it over 5 or 6 years like that? Is that sort of the
I think
way
Garland
you-
has his hand up, and he's the guy who actually implements service. I'm
I
gonna
was gonna say,
offer him a chance to.
Yeah, let's let Garland respond.
So implementing a service where we would talk about doubling our hours, the frequencies. On the operational side, transit agencies have a 2-year window to get the vehicles. So it's the ability to even get the vehicles constrains our ability to do what we wanted to do. So if we wanted to double CAT's service model, we have 36 vehicles, let's say 40 vehicles on hand, because we're ordering 4 more. We'd have to go to 80 vehicles. That 40 additional vehicles is not going to materialize overnight. We'd have to go and buy them, and there's a 2-year window to get the first tranche of vehicles from our manufacturer. So I don't know anybody who can't who has the ability to just overnight and implement a new service and double their size without a phased-in plan. Nobody does that. But you would articulate a plan, follow it, so you would be adding 10% of the service or 20% of the service every year as you got the vehicles to do so.
So is a like 6 to 7 to 8 year phase in, is that a sort of a ballpark thing that we ought to be considering?
So if you think about, let's say we approve this plan, we wanted to go for it. We're going to go hard at it. We get all the approvals we need. We need 40 more vehicles. It is realistic that as long as we have the funding, we could do 10 additional vehicles a year. So that's a 5-year model, 5-year window, which allows us to also plan the funding to do it over a 5-year period.
Okay, and obviously, if we got the funding source, it would probably take, we'd have to collect those tax revenues for a year or two before we're ready to start spending them anyway. And then the last question I had, I know we had mentioned earlier that John and the city both are doing the study on electric vehicles and alternative fuels and so on. So I remember the university is basically already, you've already made your decision there, is that right?
That's right.
We'll go with electric.
Electric.
Yeah, okay.
What kind of? EV, you know.
Just plug in. And I'm your official timekeeper, right?
Okay.
So this is a great discussion, and unless there are any more burning questions, because people are starting to head out the door, right? No more burning
One
questions?
more semi.
Okay, one more semi.
Smaller, but, yeah, and this comes from a conversation that Mr. Pike and I had a long time ago. The sort of, if we build it, they will come question. If, say tomorrow we could, snap our fingers and have the unconstrained vision implemented, are we confident people would use it? Or would there be like a whole sort of educational process that we have to convince people? Or I'm committed to doing this. I think it's the right thing to do for a lot of reasons, but I'm just wondering what you've seen in other places about, if we invest this amount of money, are people going to actually pick up?
That's a valid question. It's a good question.
I'd say at a high level, if you make service significantly more useful, people will respond to that, but it also takes some communication to let them know. And that's one of the reasons, for example, part of the reason the BRT was so successful in Richmond is there was an enormous amount of communication around it. And it was so obvious that it was there because of stations and things like that. And so in expanding service, there is an important aspect that we call out in the goals and objectives about communicating and helping people see the service, both through marketing and communications and also through improved access, stops, amenities, et cetera. So people see that it's there, even in routes that you're not building a BRT station, more frequent services. If you provide those additional amenities, people start to then notice, oh, there is something here I should maybe try, because there's a schedule posted at the stop. So you can actually see it runs till, oh my gosh, this runs till midnight. I could use this. So there's a on the ground amenities aspect to that. Sort of people will see it. And then the more general, the city, the region, and the agency obviously will need to do some communication about it. And that's where you can do things like brand a frequent network in your community and say, hey, here's the network you can rely on all the time. It's here 7 days a week, a minimum of 20 minutes, on 15 minutes most of the time, all that sort of stuff. That can be part of your branding strategy. Garland, you got something?
You have a few minutes because I'm the timekeeper now. So
I appreciate that. So I just want to echo what Scudder says. So the question was, if you build it, will they come? I believe the answer to that is yes, because if you look at what transpired in Richmond, the more frequent the service that was put into play for the network, the more ridership that would materialize. So if you take that same model here, where we are running really infrequent service, where it is really hard for folks to understand that, this service runs an hour in the morning, or 30 minutes in the morning, then an hour in the middle of the day, or jumps down to 45 minutes in the middle of the day. If we can simplify the network where it's, this service is running every 15 minutes, and that's basically how you brand the service. Every single one of our routes is running every 15 minutes. It's really easy for folks to get on board with that kind of model. because it also makes, it removes the fact where if you miss one, you don't have to wait an exorbitant amount of time for the next bus. So it simplifies the ability and also encourages people to use it. And if the network is right, I can leave my car at home and use the service.
And I am going to stop us if I can right now, because we do need to move on. I will say though, we have to be prepared to spend some money on marketing, because that's just the way it is. So you add that into your little plan. Okay, so if it's all right, I'd like to thank both of you guys so much for the great presentation. I'm sure we'll be seeing you all again. And if you don't mind, and you might want to head back to Richmond.
I'm happy to stay right now.
Okay, sounds good. But I think we will go on with the rest of our meeting so that we can get everybody out on time. We have our transit providers update. And John, Ned, you're first.
Just to piggyback on something you said, our alternative fuels study committee is meeting November 14th. This is our chair of the committee. We're presenting draft recommendations in the full job board. We'll see the presentation in December. So if you're interested, check our website out for that information. Also, we're doing a community event in Rockingham County. It's a nonprofit, faith-based organization trying to advocate for transit. So we may partner with them to expose transit to the community up there, to the rural part of Rockingham County. And I want to thank our own JAUNT here. They're letting us walk our buses with that cat. We're still working out the details, but I do appreciate them allowing us to go.
That's great. Okay, next is Charmaine is not here, so we'll move to Becca.
I don't have any update. We're in the middle of our academic session, but I would remind the community, we have 4 home football games in a row, starting this Saturday. So,
Hopefully we'll win.
yeah.
Well, what a schedule.
4 in a row, starts on Saturday. Trick or treat on the lawn back on Monday.
There you go.
Bring kids back.
Okay. And then Garland, Cat, and Charlottesville City Stores.
On the CAT side, we have seen a significant amount of interest in getting more drivers. The increase in our starting pay has helped that immensely. Juwan is there. I believe we've got 10 in the hopper on transit side and
He says yes.
the 6 on the pupil side. So that's just in 3 weeks or so. We've had an interest. We continue every single day now to get more interest. So we are working on a couple of commercials that we'll be hopefully being able to craft to get more interest because we're still significantly down in the number of drivers we need. The first step is, the home run step of getting the pay up is it has already been fruitful, and we're hoping to play that out as much as we possibly can and maximize that effort. The commercials hopefully will be running in November and December, so be on the lookout for those. That's it.
Great. Who's next? Oh, do we have somebody from DRPT today? I'm not sure. Neil, I don't see Neil. So we're good. No. Okay. Other business. Item 5. The only other business I have is to remind everybody that we canceled the November and the December meetings that were the 3rd week, which conflicted with the holidays, but we're not going to let you off the hook. We have a December the 8th. We split the difference. So our next meeting will be December the 8th, which is also a Thursday. I think, isn't it? Not a Thursday. So it should be Thursday, December the 8th. I'm looking at people, because I don't have a calendar in front of me. That's correct. Okay, good.
The question is, has implementation updated? The meeting invitations have been public.
They just come out just in time.
Yeah. Lucille will make sure Lucinda will make sure that the November, December ones go away and that we have one for December the 8th.
Yeah.
The invites. Right. Good catch though, just to make sure. All right, staff updates. Sandy, you want to go over the long-range transportation plan update?
Yes, just very, very briefly. We've officially kicked off the long-range transportation plan that the MDO was working on. I'm still working on identifying a couple of additional folks to be part of sort of the enhanced technical committee for the technical review side of the plan. But we have retained EPR as consultants to support the long-range transportation plan, so they're going to really provide support to our staff. It will still be very substantively staff driven. The other thing I want to mention is that the long-range transportation plan is also a really good opportunity to pull in some of those other items that you were talking about with the vision plan. I think one of our goals is to try to more comprehensively cover all transportation system improvements and really try to develop better coordination among the transportation goals, considering all those. I don't know exactly what that will look like, but that's certainly something that I want to make sure that we are being thoughtful about how we consider. Otherwise, I've already reached out to the two of you for information, so thank you for being responsive, and I'm sure I will continue to be reaching out to you for information.
Any questions about Sandy's? Okay. And listen, the governance study, and I think we've been alluding to this at least several times, so.
Yeah, so the governance study has started up. We hired Amy, Tom, and Peter to be working on it with us. We have selected the steering committee, and we are trying to schedule the talking for early November. We had an internal team kickoff meeting, and we're working on looking at starting to do some of the research for it.
Okay, so the governance study, my understanding is represented by, representatives from all the localities and the players. But the idea is to look at a governance model to recommend. And part of that work the governance plan will show the committee and us what we might need to take to the General Assembly by way of requests for our mother's permission from the General Assembly to have an authority, for the lack of a better way to say it. So that work will come out. So that will inform us in time, I would hope, for not this year's legislative session, but next year's legislative session to get that approval, all the I's dotted and the T's crossed.
So
I think that's correct.
if you remember the Northern Virginia presentation that took several years of reiteration of the legislation, we have the authority to make an authority. We just don't have like taxing. Yeah, we don't have funding for it. So that's what we're going to look at. We're going to try to form some type of governance structure that all the jurisdictions can agree on, and then also make a request from the general. I mean, this study won't be open, but they will set us up to make a request for taxing.
But my understanding from David was we've been told that there were some things, because we had our approval such a long time ago, that there were some things that were going to need to be updated. And that's what I was referencing. We'll know then what we need to take to the
Yeah, but
general.
even though there's existing legislation, it might have to be.
Yeah,
tweaked.
because it's legislation from 2004.
And that's part of the study.
Yeah, right. And it's legislation from 2004, I think it was. So it goes back quite a way. So I'm sure that there was some recommendation. Okay. Any other comments or questions? I'm happy to get you guys out of here as soon as possible. So I will adjourn us to December the 8th, same place, same time, 4 o'clock. And thank you very much. This was great. We really appreciate it. All right. Oh, don't forget if you park in the parking lot to get your parking back.
You know, I figured I got.